All right, we're going to look at the basic economics of chartered public schools. And some of you may be saying, what's a chartered public school? So I better explain that first. It's a public school, okay, so funded by the government, plus in some cases by whatever donor money they can find, that's not part of a school district. Okay, so it's independently chartered by some other entity, part of the state government, part of the local government, depending on the state law of the state in which that chartered public school is present. Okay, it doesn't have an attendance area. Okay, it's a school of choice. You're not assigned to it, right? You're assigned to your local neighborhood public school, and maybe you believe that it's not working for your son or your daughter, and you say, what are the alternatives? There's a chartered public school close enough to here that I'd be willing to send my child there if it's a decent fit. And okay, so that's what a chartered public school is. It's an alternative that exists for some people with the specifics defined by the state law for the state in question. 44 states have chartered public schools, and some are more open to the possibility than others. Some of those 44 have a law that says we have chartered public schools, and then have almost none because there's so many restrictions on starting one that it's not worth very many folks' while to do that. All right, so I've just flipped open the line here to my graph that describes the economics of chartered public schools, and it says generic chartered public schools. So I don't want to get into whether the chartered public school is trying to be comprehensive or generic in some pedagogical sense. So I didn't put any numbers on it. This is just the generic economics of a chartered public school. The numbers for these different spots on the graph would depend on exactly what the chartered public school is trying to do. Okay, for example, maybe it's a chartered public school for gifted and talented children. I keep saying chartered public school because that's really what it is. You may be more familiar with the term charter school. That makes it sound like they're all the same thing. And so no, they're not. They can differ widely. Nationwide, about half of chartered public schools specialize in something. So definitely a school of choice. They're not trying to reach all children, although they have to, by law, let in anybody. See now, so we're up to the first interesting item, or significant item on our graph, and the fact is that there's two supply lines. Just the regular S, which would be the supply of the good, if they could specialize in whatever it is they say they want to specialize in, like gifted and talented children, or my favorite example, sports-themed schooling, right? They could try to do that. Okay, and then this supply line would be based on the costs involved of finding teachers that are interested and talented at doing that, and finding facilities that are appropriate for that, and so on. So why this additional supply line with the little single quote up there? I call it S prime. Okay, why is that there? Well, because of that restriction that chartered public schools, charter schools, have to let in anybody that applies if there's space to let them in. So suppose you want to start a chartered public school, and you'd like it to specialize in sports theme or gifted and talented children, and some parent marches their kid in there, and that child is not gifted and talented. It's kind of hard to tell the parents that, but you know, they take tests, and you know, hey, you're just a regular kid, probably not going to do very well among all these other kids that are gifted and talented. You're going to be behind. You can say all of those things, try to counsel them out, but in the bottom line is, if that parent wants into that school and you're not full, you have to let them, and if you are full, you got to put them on the lottery list. So whenever there's space, you have to roll the dice and pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, oh, there's your name, and you sure you want in here? That's not right for your child. The person says, hey, I'm assigned to a really bad public school. I don't care what this charter public school is. I want in. All right, the alternative is a disaster, right? Okay, so the S prime line in here, the true supply of whatever type of charter public school we would be talking about, is based on the additional costs having to be ready for any child, even one that's not related to the school's intended mission, right? A not so gifted and talented child demanding to get in a gifted and talented based school, or back to that sports themed schooling, teaching reading by sports stories, writing by writing sports stories, math by doing sports related calculations. Suppose the kid falls asleep every time you say the word sports, and think, ma'am, mother, well, why do you want your child to be in here? He doesn't seem to be very interested in things related to sports. Well, again, the alternative might be really bad. And she says, Johnny isn't all that keen about sports. But the alternative of the assigned public school is so bad, we're going to hope Johnny gets interested in sports. So anyway, you got to let them. You got to carry the kids. You got to do what you can for the ones who are not engaged in what you're trying to do. That adds cost. You got to be ready for severely disabled special needs children. That adds to cost. You can't choose to specialize in children that are something other than that and say, no, we're not going to work for you. Stay in your assigned public school or find another alternative. Again, that's the reason for this additional supply. All right, now, charter public school being a public school, the way that that's defined is free. Okay? That's one of the themes that we'll get into, is that could be a problem for schooling that can differ in what it costs, because it's schooling that differs in what it does. All right, so it's free. So price of zero is down here. We go over to where the demand line hits the horizontal axis, and we see that's going to be the quantity demanded for this type of schooling at a tuition cost of zero. Okay, and the shifters of this demand line are, okay, how good are the alternatives? Are there private schools available? Those are the sorts of things that determine exactly where this line is going to be. But okay, so given all those external things, here's the amount of seats that are going to be applied for, okay, based on what this chartered public school does. And now we take our dotted line and we go all the way up to the S prime, the actual cost of this school based on the rules of the game, and we see by going over to the y-axis, okay, that it's going to take this price per year to the charter operators for the quantity supplied to be the same as this quantity demanded. What if they don't get paid this much? Well, then we're going to have a shortage or surplus. Okay, if for some reason the government payment per child is above this, well, then you can see by going a little bit above that, I didn't draw a line there, but then the amount supplied. So we would see that these kind of chartered schools then would typically have some excess capacity, some unfilled seats. Okay, so again, if it's really attractive through a high price to run a school like that, there'll be more of it available than there's demanded at a cost to the parents of zero. All right, well, that's unfortunately, well, I guess it's unfortunate in terms of people trying to find space. At least it's fortunate in terms of the government isn't spending this higher amount. Okay, but what the norm is out there is that the actual price, sorry for drawing this letters a little bit small, P with an A subscript, actual price paid is typically, for the vast majority of states, for the vast majority of types of schooling that can be under the charter label, is lower than P prime. How do we know that? Because it's the norm to have wait lists and shortages. Okay? Most chartered schools have wait lists. I know from recent discussion with a Utah state senator, he told me that every school, every chartered public school in Utah has wait list. Okay? So no matter what it is attempting to do, the actual amount that the government pays it per enrolled child per year is less than the price that it would take for there to be enough seats for the amount desired at that price of zero. All right, so for our graph, we take this piece of A out to the actual supply line based on what chartered public schools have to be ready to do if necessary. And we see that the quantity supplied at that actual price is below the quantity demanded. Okay, so that's the wait list. And Google charter public school or charter school, wait list, and you'll get a lot of hits. That's what they're describing, is the difference between the amount available and the amount demanded at a price of zero. All right, I should explain this stuff right here at the beginning. It says P-Priv few. Okay? If we ran this type of school strictly as a private school, this would be the out-of-pocket tuition, okay, and competing against free alternatives that you're assigned to means that there wouldn't be much provided and much demanded. All right, so then we go, okay, we're not going to make it be tuition driven. We're going to support it through taxes, okay, make it free to the folks to enroll in it, and now we're out to our quantity demanded out there. And now we put on the actual price, okay, and we end up with a supply that's lower than the amount demanded, a wait list. And what happens when you have a wait list for something? Well, you eliminate accountability to consumers. You enable corner cutting. You provide an incentive to cut corners. And so you start to get scandalous behavior, and unfortunately that's been part of the charter landscape. You could Google charter school, scandal, and you'd get a bunch of hits. Okay? We've got a situation where the chartered school operator can, I emphasize the word can, I'm not saying very many do that. Many of them, probably the majority, are dedicated to what they do, and they're doing everything they possibly can within the money that they have. They're donor dependent in many cases to even exist, right, to make ends meet between this price that they get from the government and what it actually costs to run their school. Google KIPP.org, KIPP.org, for a good example of charter schools that exist in most states, but for which there are huge wait lists, because it's a relatively expensive pedagogy, very popular. And because it's relatively expensive and relatively popular, donors are willing to support it, but not to the level to where the quantity available at the combined income to the charter operator, piece of A, plus what they get from donors is enough to meet this demand. You'll find that KIPP schools in all states that I know of have very long wait lists. And as far as I know, they've not been involved in doing any of the corner cutting that's created scandalous behavior from other schools. Okay? But some are taking advantage of the absence of accountability that results from a wait list, the absence of accountability to customers, to have larger classes, less credentialed teachers, in such corner cutting behavior. Why not? You lose some customers, but you got plenty waiting in line on the wait list. Okay, and of course there are some why nots, but in terms of the economics from the school's perspective, they know they're going to fill up the school even if they cut a lot of corners because of how long their wait list is. All right, so what could we do to eliminate that? Well, we could eliminate that by allowing co-payment. Okay, and people, gasp, public school, that should be free. But you have to remember that unless you allow these charter public schools to have a co-payment, some tuition payment from their customers or third parties, scholarship granting organizations, unless you do that, many of the things that would be available on the menu of schooling won't even exist. Okay, and some like KIPP, they do exist, but they exist in such small quantities that we have school chance, not school choice. What does that mean? That means you can't just go and say, I want my kid to go to this school. School says, well, that's nice. I appreciate your interest. Sorry, take your spot on the wait list, and we'll let you know if you ever get in. Well, years can pass without getting on. Meanwhile, your child is getting older and at some other school that may not be working well for them. School chance. Not sure. You might get lucky. You might get on there. Okay. School choice, not school chance, requires a price mechanism to make the quantity demanded and quantity supplied be the same thing. So, yeah, some parents are going to have to pay out of pocket. Others will find third parties that will help them make this co-payment. Where there is one, we know from the existence of a lot of chartered public schools that many of them are able to get by on the current piece of A. Okay, so not an issue there. The issue is for those who either have huge wait lists or don't exist at all that could exist otherwise. Okay, that's why we need the co-payment, a price mechanism. The co-payment would probably be in the neighborhood of a few $100s a year, maybe up to a couple thousand, depending on exactly what the school is trying to do. And then the co-payment would attract competition. So there'd be a lot more provision. We would drive the price at co-payment down to the minimum necessary to finance that type of schooling, whatever would fill this, where this word generic is, what pedagogy or subject theme that the school's mission would define. All right, we're going to look at the basic economics of chartered public schools. And some of you may be saying, what's a chartered public school? So I better explain that first. It's a public school, okay, so funded by the government, plus in some cases by whatever donor money they can find, that's not part of a school district. Okay, so it's independently chartered by some other entity, part of the state government, part of the local government, depending on the state law of the state in which that chartered public school is present. Okay, it doesn't have an attendance area. Okay, it's a school of choice. You're not assigned to it. Right? You're assigned to your local neighborhood public school, and maybe you believe that it's not working for your son or your daughter, and you say, what are the alternatives? There's a chartered public school close enough to here that I'd be willing to send my child there if it's a decent fit. And okay, so that's what a chartered public school is. It's an alternative that exists for some people with the specifics defined by the state law for the state in question. 44 states have chartered public schools, and some are more open to the possibility than others. Some of those 44 have a law that says we have chartered public schools and then have almost none because there's so many restrictions on starting one. that it's not worth very many folks' while to do that. All right, so I've just flipped open the line here to my graph that describes the economics of chartered public schools, and it says generic chartered public schools. So I don't want to get into sound like they're all the same thing, and so no, they're not. They can differ widely. Nationwide, about half of chartered public schools specialize in something, so definitely a school of choice. They're not trying to reach all children, although they have to, by law, let in anybody. See now, so we're up to the first interesting item, or significant item on our graph, and the fact is that there's two supply lines, just the regular S, which would be the supply of the good, if they could specialize in whatever it is they say they want to specialize in, like gifted and talented, whether the chartered public school is trying to be comprehensive or generic in some pedagogical sense. So I didn't put any numbers on it. This is just the generic economics of a chartered public school. The numbers for these different spots on the graph would depend on exactly what the chartered public school is trying to do. Okay, for example, maybe it's a chartered public school for gifted and talented children. I keep saying chartered public school because that's really what it is. You may be more familiar with the term charter school. That makes